Okay, hi everybody, and happy Hanukkah. And I hope everyone in Israel stays safe. May our learning provide merit for our brethren in Israel. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario, at Beth Avraham Yosef. And we are studying for webyeshiva.org. We're studying Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, the Rambam's Moreh Nevukhim. We are in the third section where we are talking about divine providence and theodicy, the perennial question of why bad things happen to good people and why the wicked seem to prosper with impunity. We were studying last time the book of Job the Sefer Iyov, in order to try and use that as the source text for the ancient Jewish tradition on understanding this question of divine providence, how a completely providential God allows there to be this seeming injustice that takes place in our world. Now, the last thing that we discussed in chapter 22 was the Rambam's whole introduction to the book of Job, whether it happened, whether it never really happened, or it's just a parable, which is the Rambam's opinion, and also the identity of this entity called Satan, that appears as the main character at the very beginning of the book of Job, sort of like as the great instigator to allow God to bring all of this suffering upon Job. In the Rambam's opinion, using this philosophical lens, is that the Satan is the personification of the physical realm that really is responsible for all of this imperfection, flaw, and the existence of evil, primarily within the heart of mankind. Today, the Rambam is going to shift focus and really focus on the main question or the main objective of the book of Job, which is theodicy, which is trying to explain this perennial question of why bad things happen to good people. And that's really what the story of Job is all about. It's an attempt to answer that question through a series of conversations that Job has both between himself and God and between himself and four of his friends. And it's a very lengthy book, and people spend years and years studying the book of Job. We're only going to be spending a few minutes studying this, and really the Rambam says, after this chapter, what I've presented to you is all you really need to know about the book of Job to try and really understand the issue of divine providence, because I'm stripping away all of the narrative and getting to the nitty-gritty. So I'm going to share my handout for you today. This handout, as we mention every time that we study together, is something that you can download very easily in one of two places. One place is the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim. It's totally free. I recommend that you join it just so that you can get regular updates about our class. And the other place is from the webyeshiva.org website in the course description for Moreh Nevukhim, section 3, chapter 23. In order for us to really appreciate where the Rambam is coming from, the Rambam, of course, as he is wont to do throughout this work, the guide, he basically takes what his understanding of current philosophical thought and superimposes it back on biblical literature. That's really the way he does it. He feels that the Bible in general possesses this ancient wisdom which has been repackaged in the philosophy of his time. And as such, when he discovers wisdom in his own time, he compares it and sort of aligns it with the text of Tanakh in order to be able to present us with this is really what the Tanakh was trying to communicate and what our sages were trying to communicate all the time. This chapter is very, very strongly linked with a chapter from 5 chapters ago, chapter 17. Chapter 17 presented us with the 5 opinions that people who believe in God harbor as far as the nature of divine providence and how God at the same time is completely providential but allows for the rise of evil in the world. And we're just going to review that very, very briefly. The Rambam had given us First, he had given us the opinion of Epicurus, which we're going to completely ignore, as the Rambam does in chapter 23, because the opinion of Epicurus is that there is no God and therefore there can be no providence. But if you believe in God, so then there are five views. The first view was the view of Aristotle. And Aristotle's view is that God is providential only on those creations that are eternal creations. Any individual component of creation that is given to coming into being and ceasing to be, like being born and dying, so to speak, is not subject to divine providence. And therefore, God is not aware of you and I. He's aware of humanity writ large in general, the species of human beings, but he's not aware of nor does he care to know about, or is he even capable of knowing about the individual members of any particular species of existence. So therefore, God is unaware of human behavior, and everything is thus purely random and by chance. This, for the Rambam, as he noted in chapter 17, is really unacceptable, especially in light of the examples that he brought, which, if you recall back from chapter 17, he sort of um, uh, invoked the memory, although not explicitly, of his brother who had died by shipwreck, and it just couldn't fathom the possibility that things happen by chance, and that his righteous beloved brother had perished at sea for absolutely no reason. He then brought the view of two philosophical schools of the Mutakalimun that we've talked about before. One is the Asherite view, a set of Islamic philosophers who believe that God's will dictates all that occurs and everything is preordained. Free will is imagined, it's not really real, and it is not for us to question God's will. In other words, God's will is completely unfathomable, it transcends human understanding, and everything that happens is by God's will, and it's therefore not for us to question. And so if we see things that appear to be evil, that's really not for us to even question, because everything happens by God's will. That's the Asherite view. We had the third view from chapter 17 was the Mutazilite view, and they talk about God's wisdom dictates what is best for all creatures. For some, prosperity is better in this world. For others, prosperity is better in the next world, in the next life. Therefore, those who suffer in this life, you shouldn't feel bad for, because they're suffering so that all of their reward and pleasure will be saved up, so to speak, and even augmented in the next realm of existence. And that's how the Mutazilites are able to reconcile divine providence and justice with the presence of evil in the world. Then the Rambam had mentioned in chapter 17 that there's a traditional Torah view, which is basically the way that many of his forebears had understood the whole concept of divine justice, and that ultimately the prevailing issue that Judaism has always asserted is Hatzur Tamim Pa'alo, that God is the rock and everything that he does is completely pure and righteous and just. And therefore, if you see people suffering, you must come to the conclusion that they deserve that suffering, and that's how we deal with it. That's how we accept it. And then the Rambam said, I believe that that view has to be modified somewhat, even though he seems to subscribe to some degree to all of the preceding views. He says that, but it's what is necessary to know is that despite some of my own co-religionists believing that divine providence extends to all creatures, I maintain that divine providence extends to only beings of intellect. Or another way of putting it is that human intellect is the key to providence. And what the Rambam said in chapter 17 really was not so clear. Whether or not he's taking a completely different view from the traditional Torah view, that is everything contingent upon justice and that everything that happens is just, what then is he actually disagreeing with that previous opinion? And what I feel that we're going to be getting out of chapter 23 is a refinement of these five views, and perhaps a better understanding of what the Rambam means when he presents his own opinion, that providence extends only to beings of intellect, only to the human condition, and that no other creature that God has made in this world, whether plant or animal, is subject to what we call hashgacha pratit, or individual divine providence, and why that is so important for the book of Job. And even though Job is a human being and you would expect him to be privy to divine providence directly and individually, why he was not privy to divine providence is something that the Rambam already alluded to in the previous chapter. His only point that he said is that it's important to note that when scripture describes Job's greatness, it only talks about him in terms of his righteous deeds. It does not talk about in terms of his wisdom or of his enhanced intellect. And as the Rambam had said in chapter 17, divine providence is commensurate to one's intellectual development. And so it seems like the Rambam was trying to imply that the reason why Job suffered so much is because he did not know God properly. He did not have a refined enough intellect to be worthy of the individual interference of God into his life in order to be able to prevent him from the Satan's afflictions that he was presented with. But we're going to have to refine that very, very seriously as we go through this chapter. We're going to have to, unfortunately, due to time constraints, go through it somewhat quickly, but I hope that I'll be able to cover the main points. The Rambam now aligns these 5 views with further refinement with the opinions of Job and his 4 friends. So remember, there are 5 opinions that are presented in the book of Job, and the Rambam's going to align them with the 5 opinions of the theists in chapter 17. Each one of Job's friends, that is, other than Job himself, agreed that God was aware of what was befalling Job, that B, God caused Job's suffering deliberately, and C, God was incapable of injustice or wrongdoing. Now, I say that's only true of Job's 4 friends. Job himself, actually, as we'll see in a moment, questions whether God was even aware of what was happening to him, or perhaps God was somehow confused or obscured in some way, and that's the reason why he was suffering. But at least Job's friends all agreed that God was doing something deliberately to Job for a reason, and that God was ultimately just. They also agreed that everyone who does good obtains a reward, and everyone who does evil is punished. And if you see a bad man prospering, justice will eventually prevail, either in that person or in that person's offspring. Conversely, if you see a righteous man suffering, justice will eventually prevail either in that person or in his offspring. So one of the ways of answering the question as to why or how can God allow the righteous to suffer is that there is a continuum. And just because a righteous person suffers doesn't mean that their offspring will suffer. Maybe the offspring will receive multiple times of reward as a compensation for the father's suffering, which is some sort of what we say in the book of Psalms. Nar hayiti gam zakanti velo ra'iti tzadik ne'ezav v'zar'o mevakesh lachem. That even if sometimes a righteous man is forsaken, but his seed will never want for bread, because there'll be sort of some kind of equalization through the next generation or the succeeding generations. And the same thing is true with wicked people. If we see wicked people in some way prospering, don't worry, the comeuppance will occur in the next generation. And then the Rambam writes, despite the overlap and agreement among Job's friends, the point of the book is to accentuate the differences between their respective approaches and how each one of Job's friends, including Job, uniquely explained his theology on why the ultimately righteous man Job suffered so greatly. And the Rambam makes a point of saying that this is something that you have to look for in the text, because it's very easy to read the text and miss the subtle distinctions of opinion between the different voices in this narrative. So opinion number 1 is the opinion of Job himself before the end of the book of Job, before Job comes to his great epiphany and realization that he was wrong all along. The first opinion is Eov himself. And as we'll see, This is the opinion that lines up with Aristotle. Remember what we said about Aristotle is that Aristotle did not believe in individual divine providence for individual human beings. And that's actually what it seems that Job believed. He felt that God was making a mistake or that God was not aware that he was suffering. Job believed that God has no regard for mankind at all. And that is why there is no difference between what befalls the righteous and what befalls the wicked. He thus states, and by the way, we're going to run through some of these psukim very quickly, but I would encourage you to take this handout and work on this yourself if you want to try to work through the verses in the book of Job. But he says, Achati al kenomarti tam verashahu mechale, that everything is the same, Job said. God destroys both the innocent and the wicked in the same way. Imshot yamit pitom lamasat nikiyim yilag, that even God scoffs at when the righteous are swept away by a storm. In other words, it makes no difference to the Lord. Both the good and the evil suffer the same fate. I won't go through all of the verses that he quotes, but he says, Yachar alafar yishkavu v'rima techase alehem. When it comes to the righteous and the wicked, they all meet the same fate. They'll all end up sleeping in the dust. Okay, and the maggots will end up covering both of them. The wicked see no suffering in chapter, again in chapter 21. V'im zacharti v'nivhalti, that I'm frightened to even contemplate as to Madur Rishayim Yichyu, why is it that the wicked prosper? Zaram nachon lifnehem imam v'tze'etzaehem le'enehem. He says even the descendants of the wicked prosper with complete impunity, without any repercussions. Now he rejects the argument that retribution meets the children of the wicked, because if how does that harm the wicked man after he's passed? A person passes away, he's not aware at all of what transpires to his children. So why is that an equalization, and why is that just? A man was wicked his whole life and prospers, and God's going to take it out on his offspring. The person who's passed away doesn't care. What care does a person have about the household that he leaves after him when he's already been cut off from this world? He then says that God seems to have forsaken individual human beings despite having created us all. He goes through in chapter 10, Job goes through this extensive argument about how God has formed every single creature of the world. Or ubasar talbisheni, you God, you adorned me with flesh and bones or skin. Uva'atzamot v'gidim tzochecheni, you cover me with bones and with sinews. V'lama, I'm just skipping many verses. V'lama meirechem hot seitani, why did you produce me from the womb? Egva, that when I perish, va'ayin lo tir'eni, and yet no eye sees me. In other words, you're not providential, God. You have taken all of this effort to create me, but then you sort of leave me to the vicissitudes of existence without even caring about what happens to me. Now, our sages tell us that Job began to blaspheme by saying all of these things. But at the same time, they also said that we should not cast blame upon Job for having come up with these very, very mistaken beliefs about God, because people are not fully responsible for their utterings when undergoing such abject suffering as Job underwent. And so therefore, you find the statement of the Talmud, Amar Rava, Afra lepume de'iyov, may dust enter into the mouth of Job to silence him, because what he said was true heresy, that God is not providential. Amar Rava, mikan shekafar Iyov b'tchiyat hametim, Job even denied the idea of the resurrection. And Amar Rabba, Iyov b'sa'ara charafu b'sa'ara heshivuhu, that Job blasphemed by talking about the wind, because he thought that maybe the wind was too noisy, and therefore that God mistook Job's identity, because the word Eov, Job in Hebrew, can easily be confused with the word Oyev, which means the enemy. And so maybe God, because it was so windy, heard about a man named Oyev, thought it was the word enemy, when really his name was Eov. And so that's, I mean, of course, this is all meant metaphorically, but basically Job really questioned whether God could even be aware or carefully aware of what was transpiring. Amar lefanav, Ribono shel olam, shema ruach se'ara avra lefanecha v'nitchalef lecha ben Iyov le'oyev. God, is it possible that it was very windy and you couldn't hear properly, and therefore you thought my name was Oyev, the enemy? Amar lo. And there's a very extensive Gemara. We're not going to go through the entire Talmudic passage, but I would encourage you. It's on Bava Batra, page 16, bottom of 16a, top of 16b. I encourage you to take a look at that Talmudic passage. There are so many examples of how precise God's creation is. And God says, my creation is so precise. I am completely providential and aware of what's going on in the world. Do you really think I could make such a gross error of mistaking you for Oyev instead of Eov? He says, Harbe nimin barati, just the first example. Harbe nimin barati ba'adam. God says, I've created many pores in a person's scalp. V'chol nima v'nima barati laguma bifnei atzma. Every pore has its own hole for a hair follicle to grow. Shelo yu shtaim yonkot miguma echat, because shilmale shtaim yonkot miguma echat machshichot moreh nav shel adam. If a person would have two hairs growing from the same pore or the same follicle, it would be disastrous. He would become disabled and go blind. So he says, if I am so precise in my creation that I don't allow these deformities to arise in human beings, do you think I could have possibly made a mistake between Eov and Oyev? And there are many, many more examples that are given in the Gemara. And therefore, the Gemara ends up quoting a verse from the book of Job, chapter 34, Iyov lo bedat yidaber udvarav lo bahaskel, that Job did not speak with proper knowledge. He did not have discernment when he spoke because he was suffering. We can't really blame a person for the things he says at a time of his suffering. Like, many times people who had gone through the Shoah said many things that might be deemed by a theologian as heretical, but we can't take them to task for it because of their great suffering and all of the horrors that they witnessed. And so the same thing, the Talmud is sort of giving a pass to Job and saying we can't blame him because he suffered tremendously. Now, the Rambam says, you know what, despite the sage's statement, there is a deeper meaning to Job's epiphany and change of heart. It's not that by the end of the book, he was able to gather his thoughts more properly despite his suffering, but rather there actually was a change in his attitude. And it's not like he spoke just words that were nonsensical before and then came to a realization at the end. But he actually had a paradigm shift in his theological beliefs, in his philosophical beliefs. Job, and by the way, it's not that the Rambam means to disagree with the way the Talmud depicts it, but he says the Talmud is depicting the surface explanation, but I want to take it one step deeper, that there's really something deeper that's going on in Job's change of heart. Job originally thought, like most of us, who only know God by dint of accepting his authority, that suffering is deprivation of physical assets like wealth, children, and health. Meaning that when a person is deprived of physical assets in life, whether it be wealth, children, or his own personal health, his own personal well-being, then if a person is deprived of those things, then that's called suffering. That's called true, real privation. But as his knowledge of God grew, he realized that true happiness is not to be found in these things, but rather in a knowledge of God, such that physical privation can never remove a person's true happiness in life. And this, for the Rambam, is the most important lesson in the book of Job, that Job transforms from a person who's focused on the physical world because despite his righteousness, despite his acceptance of divine authority, despite his acceptance of what we would call Ol Malchut Shamayim, the yoke of heaven, Job observed the mitzvos dutifully, but he had no appreciation for a knowledge of Hashem. He had not developed his intellect to properly appreciate who God is. And what he didn't achieve this idea called dveikut, of ultimate intellectual attachment to the Almighty. And therefore, when he was presented with deprivation in the physical world, he felt he was suffering because he didn't realize that true reality is an epistemological reality of my mind being conjoined with God. And when I can conjoin my mind with God, then my body is of no consequence. Then what happens outside of my mind that is ultimately connected with the Ribono Shel Olam, then nothing else matters. And that's the reason why he went through this change. It's not that the suffering diminished and therefore he came to his senses. It was rather that he realized there is no suffering. My body is of no consequence. Almost like an Eastern philosophical kind of attitude that there is no body, there is no room that I'm sitting in, there is no physical accompaniment to me. Anything that is important is taking place in my mind. And as long as I have a knowledge of God and I feel connected to the Almighty, then everything else is of no consequence, and I can achieve true happiness through my intellectual state of harmony and well-being. Job thus realized that his previous mourning over his physical losses was a mistake in perspective, and that as long as he possessed intellect and knowledge of God, this was true happiness. And he quotes the end of the book of Job to sort of demonstrate that. L'shema ozen shematicha va'ata eini ra'atcha. That I've finally have been able to listen to your voice, O God, and I've finally been able to see you. Al kain emas v'nichamti, and therefore I despise my past and I find consolation. Al afar va'efer, over my past, where I had been wallowing in the dirt and the ash. And what essentially the way the Rambam reads that verse is, I realized that I was wrong to be in a state of mourning for feeling deprived and for being subjected to suffering. I was never deprived. I was never subjected to suffering, because as long as I'm connected to God in my mind and I possess that ultimate knowledge of Hashem, I am truly a wealthy person and nothing else matters. So he's basically saying, V'nichamti alafer va'efer, I have remorse over having been in a state of mourning for my losses. I never lost anything. And nothing of consequence was ever lost to me. I had riches that are infinite all the time. And I want to point out, and this is really what the Rambam is doing, is that he's saying that Job and Job's final friend Elihu, who really helps Job see the light, are really aligned. And we'll get to this by the end of this year. But I want to point out that, remember, the Rambam started by telling us that Job really represents, in his initial stage, the Aristotelian view that there is no providence at all. And yet he ends up depicting Job in his epiphanous end as also an Aristotelian, even though we reject the Aristotelian view of divine providence, because there's no way that we can reconcile Aristotle's view of God not being providential of the human condition. But at the same time, he depicts Job as having found ultimate truth of that divine knowledge is all that matters. That's a very Aristotelian attitude, because Aristotle talks about true happiness. He calls it eudaimonia in his Nicomachean Ethics, which is a whole book on how man is supposed to find this state of ultimate happiness and harmony in his life through the pursuit of living a life of awareness and really the refinement of his intellect. Through you can find ultimate happiness, which the term that Aristotle uses is eudaimonia, that sense of well-being, through your rational faculty. It doesn't matter what you possess. So even though the Rambam has to be docha, has to reject the Aristotle on one hand, he ends up embracing Aristotle with the other hand. Let's go to the other opinions. Opinion number two, which is that of Eliphaz, one of the first of Job's friends that makes a presentation, and the Rambam sort of aligns this with the traditional Torah view. God is absolutely just, so everything that befell you, Job, was deserved. And of course, that's a horrible thing if someone is going through suffering, to basically say to them that it must be that you deserve it, that no matter how righteous you are, every human being receives what they deserve. And no one wants to hear that. And that's why Eliphaz is criticized, even within the text, for having been so callous as to present this. But there's nevertheless truth to it, in that God is ultimately just. He concluded that Job must have committed evil, and as it says in chapter 22, Halo ra'atcha rabba ve'in kates la'avonotecha. Your evil must be great. There must be some really, really deep source of evil or sinfulness that exists within you that makes you deserving of this. Despite Job's righteousness, no human being, says Eliphaz, is capable of perfection. Hein ba'avadav lo ya'aminu v'malachav yasim tahala. So he says, because God can't even fully have confidence in his angels, the celestial creatures that he creates that don't even possess any corporeal aspects to them. And therefore, certainly that's true about those of us who are encased within a mortal frame, that God obviously sees flaw within us. Even though we don't always perceive the direct cause and effect, man always deserves what he receives. And Job, of course, has difficulty reconciling that, and that's why Eliphaz's opinion is rejected. Opinion number 3 in the book of Job is that of Bildad HaShuchi, Bildad the Shuchite. And the Rambam says this aligns with the Mutazilite view that we saw above from chapter 17, that God's wisdom dictates what is best for you. If you suffer in this life, it is only so that you will receive the greater good that God has deemed for you in the afterlife. He thus says to Job in chapter 8, Im zach v'yashar ata, ki ata ya'ir alecha v'shilam nevat tzidkecha. If you are truly upright and righteous, then God will give you your compensation for all of your righteousness. V'haya reshitcha mitzar v'archaritecha yisgem ma'od. Even though you may start off in your initial existence in this world as being somewhat diminished, but don't worry, in the end, you will completely be prosperous and you will be very, very successful. So therefore, that's the Mutazilite view, that, don't just look at the tip of the iceberg, this existence, look at the totality of existence. And therefore, if a person suffers in this life like you are, Job, don't worry, it's because God wants to save all of your reward for the next life. Opinion number 4 is that of Tzofar HaNa'amati. That's the Asherite view, that everything occurs through God's unfathomable will. It is not for us to question why. We should only accept it and never question it. He thus tells Job in chapter 11, V'ula mi tena lo kadaber v'yiftach sifatav imach. Who has the right or the chutzpah, the audacity to ask God for an explanation for what he does? V'yagid lecha talumot chachma ki chiflaim letushia v'da ki yash lecha elokecha me'avonecha hachekar eloka timtza imad tachlit shakai timtza. Is there any way for a human being to even fathom the depths of God's will and God's wisdom? There's no way for us to understand it, and therefore no one has the right to even question God. And of course, that is one view. The Rambam is not saying that these views are completely off the mark. They are within an acceptable sort of parameters of theology. However, they are not the complete answer and certainly not the most satisfactory answer. And then you get to opinion number 5, which, as we see, the Rambam aligns with Job's final and epiphanous realization that we mentioned above, that true happiness is not to be found in the physical realm through things that you acquire in life. It is only through a greater knowledge of God that man can accept his lot in life, concluding that God's wisdom guides everything properly. Elihu, and the Rambam just prefaces his comments on Elihu, who is Job's 4th friend. He's identified as the youngest of the friends, who speaks last because out of respect to the older comrades of Job, but he's also the most perfect in knowledge. He reproaches Job for investing too much stock in his good deeds and thus failing to understand how misfortune could befall him. Don't take so much pride in how righteous a life you've experienced, because no one really knows whether they may have done things that they've forgotten about. He criticizes Job's other 3 friends, the ones that we've seen before, Eliphaz, Bildad, and so far. He says they're speaking out of old age and they don't really understand. The young man among you is the one who's going to explain it. Even though he seems to repeat all that Job and his friends had stated, there are 3 subtle, unique points that only Elihu makes, And the Rambam tells us that it's very hard to sort of hone in on these 3 points unless you're a discriminating reader. And so therefore, he mentions these 3 things. Firstly, Elihu discusses divine intervention via an angel. That, when it occurs in a person's life, will only occur 2 or 3 times, but not incessantly. What he means by that is that when you look at the verses in Hebrew, what Job is, what Elihu is essentially telling Job is that everyone has moments in their lives when they are subject to some kind of miraculous intervention. It could be when they get sick and all of a sudden, the doctors say, you're deathly ill, and all of a sudden the person goes through a miraculous recovery. It could be that a person was standing on a ledge and he should have fallen, but miraculously he was saved. In other words, 2 or 3 times in a person's life, he may have those experiences where he feels that an angel was watching over him. That's the first point that Elihu makes that Job's other friends do not make. The second point that, and by the way, there doesn't seem to be any explanation for why he mentions that, but we're going to tie this all together in a moment. The second point that Elihu makes is that he talks about the mystery of how God communicates to prophets. Sometimes a person will only be able to have one glimpse or vision of God in a prophetic experience, in a chalom, or in a dream, in a vision of night, when sleep has overtaken a person, and he'll be visited in a prophecy. That's the second point that Elihu makes. And the third point that Elihu makes, he talks about the magnificence of creation, the vastness of creation, and how God teaches us through nature about the sort of the mysteriousness and the incredibleness of the way that God guides the universe. Malafenu mi bahamot aretz, that it says in chapter 35 that God instructs us through all of the creatures of this earth. Ume'of hashamayim yechakemenu, and God makes us wise through the animal kingdom and from the birds of the heavens. Now, then the Rambam says, after Elihu has made these 3 points, he then seems to intertwine Elihu's wisdom with Job's final epiphany, which is at the final chapters of the book of Job, chapters 38 to 42 of the book of Job. Job himself is revisited by God, who dwells on the same subject of the wonders of nature. And God, in communicating with Job, especially dwells on the awesome Leviathan creature, which represents all different kinds of creatures, because the Leviathan possesses some aspects of mammals, some aspects of the fish, and some aspects of a flying creature. Apparently, the Leviathan has all 3 powers. Maybe he's like a dragon, a sea dragon, who can fly and who can swim. But the Leviathan represents the totality of the awesomeness of God's creation, especially over God's tutelage over the animal kingdom. But the point that the Rambam is making, and the Rambam speaks almost poetically towards the end of this chapter, is that taken in the aggregate, these additional lessons that Elihu presents and that are elaborated upon by God to Job teach Job that, number one, despite the apparent chaos, God is providential over all of man's actions, interceding on his behalf at different junctures in his life, while still allowing the laws of nature to govern overall. And I'm just presenting this based on the Shem Tov commentary. What Elihu wanted to point out to Eov is that it's impossible to believe that God is not providential. You yourself, Eov, probably had experiences in your life where you felt that there was an angel watching over you. How could you possibly believe that God has not been there for you at different times in your life? That's the first idea that Elihu pointed out, is that people do at different points in their life, it could be maybe only 2 or 3 times in life, realize that God intervenes, even though every human being is given to the laws of nature, which by necessity require us to eventually get sick and die. Number 2, God's providence extends to humans alone, based on their intellect, which makes them privy to divine visitation and prophecy. And that's the second point that Elihu wants to make. And remember, this goes back to the Rambam's view that divine providence is commensurate to intellect. Any being that is not a being of intellect cannot achieve divine providence. does not really receive God's divine intervention on a personal basis. And that was the point that Elihu was trying to make by pointing out that God visits individuals in prophetic dreams. You see that providence extends to people who have enhanced their intellect. And then the third point that Elihu was making is that providence is impossible for the human mind to fathom, just as we cannot fathom the way nature operates. Divine providence over nature has no comparison to human providence over the things that we govern. So, for example, I might be in charge of running a company, but the way that I run a company has no real, it's not really comparable to the way that God runs the universe, just as natural acts differ from those humanly manufactured. So when I want to build a chair, right, I have to get wood and I have to get nails and I have a very linear method of building a chair. But when God wishes to create things in the universe, his methodology is completely different from ours, and therefore his providence is completely different from ours. It does have a smacking, this third point, of the Asherite view that God's will is unfathomable. But it's not saying that it's completely unfathomable, but it's just trying to get us to appreciate that even when we see seeming injustices, we should not attribute that to any kind of ignorance on God's part or any injustice on God's part. God has a rhyme and a reason. There's a method to his madness, so to speak. Now, through this greater understanding of God through his creation, man comes to a greater sense of peace of mind and happiness. The eudaimonia that we mentioned above, that this epiphanous transformation that takes place in Eov by the end of the book. And it's really prompted through Elihu's teaching, and then God through speaking to Eov at the end of the book. This is once again why Job concluded, Al kain emas v'nichamti al afar va'efer. That is why I repent and have remorse over having thought that I was suffering and therefore sat in mourning over my losses. I really was never in a state of loss, because as long as I have knowledge of God, I am truly a wealthy person. And about such an attitude, the Rambam cites the Talmud in Tractate Shabbat, that Tanu Rabbanan, our sages taught, aluvin ve'inan olvin, those who are disgraced and do not disgrace others. Shomin cherpatan ve'inan mishivin, if they hear their own disgrace, if they hear their own shame, but they don't respond to it. Osin me'ahava usmechin b'yisrin, those who serve God out of love and rejoice even when they are presented with privation and affliction. Alehen hakatuv omer, about such people, Scripture says, va'ohavav kitzeit hashemesh b'gevurato, that God's beloved ones, those who suffer in silence and even with joy, are like the going out of the sun in all of its strength. In other words, the reason why it seems that the Rambam is invoking this idea is that when you look at nature and you have an appreciation of the way that God manages the entire system of creation, then you can really feel a part of that creation, just like the sun goes on its trajectory every day. The faithful person who realizes that he's part of that system is such a person is constantly in a state of joy in being part of a larger construct that is just and perfect and amazing. And finally, the Rambam says, if you meditate upon everything I have told you with the attention that ought to be practiced in meditating upon this treatise, and you consider the book of Job, its meaning will become clear to you, and you will find that I have summed up all its notions, etc., etc. So he says, don't focus on the details, just look at the main points that I've presented you with. And that's how really the Rambam finishes chapter 23 and his discussion of the book of Job. My only concluding remarks are, and I've just put my notes in writing, in the previous chapter, the Rambam had noted that while Job was righteous, he did not possess perfect intellect a perfect intellect or a knowledge of God. And this is why he suffered in the way he did, because a person can only be privy to perfect divine intervention in his life if he has a perfected intellect. But this can be understood in one of two ways. Only those with more perfect knowledge are privy to more perfect providence and will thus not suffer as much. Or B, those with more perfect knowledge do not perceive the privation of the physical as suffering, and as such are always happy and in a state of eudaimonia. Now, does the Rambam mean to say both ideas or only one? That's the only point of ambiguity which I'm left with after studying the two chapters on Job. I wanted to share that sort of somewhat a slight ambiguity in my understanding of what the Rambam wants to leave us with. We do know that by the end of the book of Job, Job regains all of his physical prosperity. And it therefore could be that once he becomes this perfected being of intellect, God now sort of reinserts himself into Job's life and grants him more physical blessing. But the physical blessing that Job achieves at the end of his life is completely different from the physical blessing that he had while he was a sort of an unenlightened individual, because when he was unenlightened, he looked at the physical blessing as an end unto itself. Whereas now at the end of the book, he looks at the physical blessing in the way that the Rambam describes physical blessing in his Mishnah commentary to Perek Chelek, to the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin, which is that it's a means to a greater end. The purpose of having physical blessing is so that you can focus your attention on your knowledge of God. And so perhaps both statements are true. Perhaps because Job did not use his intellect properly, he did not merit to have divine intervention to allow him to have all of these physical assets in life. But once he perfected his intellect and realized that he had never really lost anything and he was truly a happy person, regardless of whether he had things or not, God granted him more physical assets, more physical blessing to enable him to enhance his intellect even to a higher level. And that's just something that sort of remains a little bit not completely presented by the Rambam. As we've mentioned many times before, the Rambam doesn't always lead us so directly. He really wants us to be able to come up with some of these conclusions on our own and only alludes to us the right direction that we're supposed to go. But this is where I'd like to leave you at this point with sort of an overview of this chapter, which really deserves much more analysis. But that's our shir for today. And I believe that I'll be traveling next week. So our next shiur will be in 2 weeks from today. I hope to see you then. In the meantime, again, a happy Hanukkah. Let's all be safe, and prayers for all of Israel. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.